While interviewing my great-uncle, Sam Kaufman, I had no doubt in my mind that he was aware of what was going on during the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. He lived in Montgomery, Alabama during the 60s when he was about 30 years old with his wife Liza and his son David. He later on had two more kids. He worked at a law firm right across the street from the Montgomery courthouse where many important decisions were made that affected the Civil Rights Movement.
Segregation was not an issue really until the 1954 Supreme Court decision, on schools integration. And but they did. Mother was liberal-minded, and she had some good friends felt the same way, and but everything was totally segregated, and the number of people that questioned it were very, very few. And the Police Force Act and the politicians all kind of acted as enforcers of segregation, and nobody fought it in any way. And yet these had these small groups of, maybe 5% of the voters or something that thought it was a bad system, but they didn't do anything publicly. But we knew everything that was going on. Meanwhile, we went to Europe. I was in the military and went to Munich, and we were there. We got there really about just a little after the bus boycott started, so we wasn't involved in any of that because we just kept up with it in the newspapers. And then I got back to Montgomery, and I knew I wanted to practice law, but I didn't get any offers from big firms, and later I figured out that they were a little worried about me because my parents were known to be integrationists. One thing about practicing law, the whole system was obsessed with the fight over integration, and particularly the legal system. You could not talk about any other subject. I mean, if you go to the courthouse, everybody would bring up whatever was going on that day. And I kept quiet, but I think they kind of knew that I didn't agree, but I never publicly said anything about it.
But as Thoreau and MLK would call them, they would be considered white moderates. They wanted equality to be achieved, but weren't willing to sacrifice their success and safety in order to accomplish it. Many weren't willing to take a stand. It is quite evident to me why my Uncle Sam didn't want to publicly state his opinions, even though people in the town knew their views on the subject matter anyways.
But there was real controversy and fear, and I guess the main feeling that existed was just fear. You just, all the time, you never knew. You lived in fear that something bad was going to happen, because a lot of bad things did happen. And the violence on the bridge was on national TV, and it was on ABC, and everybody was watching it. And of course, Lyndon Johnson spoke out against it. Everybody was. So when they decided to have the real march, and they gathered in Selma, and of course we knew they were coming to Montgomery, and all Montgomery was up in arms over it, And but they weren't going to stop it, but they were scared and talking about it all the time. And people, all these famous people came to town. That parade, that march lasted 4 hours, 25,000 people, walking kind of slow. And everybody was, in the beginning, they all were, bad talking, accusing them of being fakes and the terrible people, communists, and that's what the people on the sidewalk were saying. But about halfway through, they stopped saying that, and by the end, they were in shock. You just couldn't be on that corner and see that 4 hours of people, and you had to realize that history was being made. I realized it, and I guess everybody, because they quieted down, and just knew that they had lost the battle. And so the main difference after that was it's like a nightmare was over, and the nightmare being the total obsession with preserving segregation. And there were merchants, everybody was tired of it, been going on nonstop from 1955, to 1965. That was 10 full years that you could not talk about any other subject but that.
And history was definitely made. Hearing my Uncle Sam's perspective on the movement was fascinating and made me wonder what I would have done if I were in his place. I'd like to think that I would have joined in with the protests and marches, but after talking to my Uncle Sam, my thoughts have shifted. The stakes were extremely high, especially in a town filled with people who had very strong beliefs on the subject matter that wouldn't be afraid to threaten others who didn't think the same thing. The interview made me think about what was going on today in Ferguson and how our country keeps repeating the same mistakes that we promise will never happen again. My Uncle Sam isn't a bad person for not speaking up for what he believed in. It was probably a smart decision at the time. He would have threatened his family's safety and success in his career. Although Martin Luther King Jr. was right in the fact that if we had waited any longer, the issue would not have been solved. I think it is good to be aware of what is going on in the world because history repeats itself, as we've seen with issues going on in Ferguson. But we can teach our children and later generations the importance of equality for all races, genders, sexual orientation, etc. Just like my grandparents did to my parents, and how my parents taught me. I don't think we all need to necessarily get involved to the extent of protesting if you feel that it will jeopardize your safety unless you want to. Talking about the problem and making people more aware of it makes changes as well. Everyone can make a difference in their own way.